1944, when German POW Friedrich Weber stepped off the train in Mississippi. He expected to see the weak, decadent Americans his Führer had promised. Instead, he saw 12-year-old schoolchildren who towered over battle-hardened Wehrmacht soldiers. These American boys were 6 inches taller and 40 pounds heavier than German teenagers of the same age, fed on fresh milk and white bread, while his own son back home was eating sawdust mixed with flour. What did these giants reveal about which nation had already lost the war before a single shot was fired? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the summer of 1944, Germany was losing the war. The country had been fighting for 5 years, and now everything was falling apart. In Berlin and Hamburg and every German city, bombs fell from the sky almost every night. Fathers were dead or gone to fight. Mothers worked in factories making guns and bullets. Children went to school hungry and came home to empty kitchens. The German government gave each child a ration card. This card said how much food they could have each week. Most children got about 1,200 calories each day. That is less food than a grown man needs just to sit still. Growing children need much more. But there was no more to give. The bread they ate was dark and heavy. It was made from potato flour and sawdust mixed together. It tasted like dirt and sat in the stomach like a stone. Real white bread was just a memory from before the war. Every day at school, teachers told the children that suffering made them strong. They said Germans were the best people in the world because they could survive on so little. They said Americans were soft and weak because they had too much. The Hitler youth groups met after school and sang songs about being tough and hard like steel. The children learned that going without food was noble. They learned that thin bodies and hollow cheeks were signs of strength and sacrifice. But the children were not getting stronger. They were getting smaller. 11-year-old boys who should have been 4.5 feet tall only reached 4 feet. 13-year-old girls weighed 70 pounds instead of 90. Their teeth came in crooked because their bodies had no calcium. Their bones grew soft. They got sick easily and stayed sick for weeks. The whole generation was shrinking while their parents and teachers told them this made them superior. Friedrich Weber knew all of this because he had an 11-year-old son named Hans back in Stuttgart. Before Friedrich left to fight in France, he had held his boy close and felt how thin he was. Hans barely reached his father's chest. His arms were like sticks. His ribs showed through his shirt. But Hans stood straight and proud, because that was what German boys were supposed to do. Friedrich told him to be brave and strong. He did not tell him he was scared his son might not survive another winter. Now, Friedrich was 32 years old and a prisoner of war. He had been a captain in the Wehrmacht. He had fought at Normandy when the Americans invaded France. He had believed everything he was taught. He believed Germans were strong and Americans were weak. He believed Germany would win because they had the will to sacrifice everything. Then the Americans came with more tanks than he had ever seen, more planes, more guns, more men, more of everything. They captured him in July and put him on a ship across the Atlantic Ocean. The ship took 2 weeks to cross. Friedrich and 500 other German prisoners stayed below deck in the dark. They got 2 meals a day. Each meal had more food than Friedrich had seen in months. There was white bread. Real white bread, soft and fresh. There was meat. There was cheese. Some of the prisoners cried when they ate because they had forgotten food could taste like this. Friedrich did not cry, but he felt something break inside him. If this was how the Americans fed their prisoners, how did they feed their soldiers? How did they feed their children? The ship landed in New York and the prisoners were put on trains heading south. Friedrich had never been to America. He pressed his face against the train window and watched the country roll past. He saw farms with fat cows and green fields. He saw towns with houses that had no bomb damage. He saw factories with smoke rising from chimneys, making things, always making more things. Every station they passed had food shops with windows full of bread and fruit. He saw no ration lines. He saw no rubble. It was like the war was not even happening here. After 3 days, the train stopped in a small town in Mississippi. The sign said the town had 5,000 people. The prisoners were told to line up on the platform. Guards would march them through town to the camp 2 miles away. It was August and the heat pressed down like a heavy blanket. Friedrich's uniform was stiff with old sweat and salt from the ocean. He lined up with the others and waited for the march to begin. Then he saw them. Group of American children stood at the corner near the station. They were waiting to cross the street. There were maybe 10 or 12 of them. They looked like they were coming home from some summer activity. They wore short pants and light shirts. They carried baseball gloves and lunch bags. They were laughing and pushing each other the way children do, but they were enormous. Friedrich stopped walking. The guard behind him shouted to keep moving, but Friedrich could not move. He stared at the children. The smallest one looked about 10 years old and came up to Friedrich's shoulder. Friedrich was 5 feet and 8 inches tall. That child was maybe 4.5 feet. That was normal. But the older children were not normal. Not by any measure, Friedrich knew. A boy who looked 12 years old stood almost 5 feet and 8 inches. He was nearly as tall as Friedrich. His shoulders were broad and square. His arms had real muscle on them. His legs were thick and strong. His face was tan and healthy. His teeth were white and straight when he smiled. He looked like a young god from an old painting. Next to him stood a girl maybe 14. She was 5.5 feet tall. She had long, strong legs and stood up straight. Her hair shined in the sun. Her skin was clear and perfect. She looked like she had never missed a meal in her life. She looked like she had never been afraid or cold or hungry. Friedrich thought of Hans, his little Hans, who was 11 and so small. Hans, who had to punch new holes in his belt because his pants fell down. Hans, whose baby teeth fell out, but whose adult teeth came in twisted because his body had nothing to build them with. Hans, who got tired walking upstairs. Mein Gott, whispered the prisoner next to him. They are giants. The American children crossed the street and walked past the line of prisoners. They glanced at the Germans with mild curiosity, but no fear. Why would they be afraid? They were bigger than the enemy. A 12-year-old American boy could look a German soldier in the eye. The guard shoved Friedrich forward and the line started moving again. But Friedrich could not stop looking back at those children. They were growing smaller in the distance, but the truth of them was growing larger in his mind. Everything he had been told was wrong. Everything he believed was a lie. The master race was starving while these Americans grew tall as trees. How could Germany win a war when its children looked like this and American children looked like that? The camp was called Como, and it sat in the middle of flat farmland that stretched to the horizon. The barracks were new wood buildings with screens on the windows. Each man got a bed with a mattress and 2 blankets. Friedrich had slept on the ground in France for 3 months. He had slept in the ship on a hard bunk. This bed felt soft as a cloud. That first night he lay awake wondering if this was some kind of trick. On the 3rd morning, the guards took all the prisoners to the mess hall for breakfast. The building was long and clean with tables in neat rows. The prisoners lined up with metal trays. Friedrich moved through the line and watched as each server put food on his tray. First came scrambled eggs. Real eggs, yellow and steaming. Then 2 pieces of white bread with butter. Then 3 strips of bacon. Then a cup of fresh milk so cold it made the cup sweat. Then an apple. Friedrich sat down at a table and stared at his tray. The other men stared too. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, an older prisoner named Klaus picked up his fork and took a bite of eggs. His eyes closed. A sound came from his throat that was almost a sob. Then everyone began to eat. Friedrich ate slowly. He had not tasted bacon in 4 years. The bread was soft and sweet. The milk was rich and cold. The apple was crisp and tart. He ate everything on his tray, and his stomach hurt because it was not used to so much food. But it was a good hurt. Around him, men were crying as they ate. Some were laughing. One man said this was more food than he gave his own children in a week back home. Another said the Americans fed their prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. Friedrich thought about Hans eating his sawdust bread for breakfast. He thought about his wife Anna standing in ration lines for hours to get one potato. He put his head in his hands and did not know whether to laugh or scream. 2 weeks later, Friedrich was assigned to a work detail on a local farm. The farmer's name was Mr. Johnson, and he needed help bringing in the cotton crop. He was an older man with sun-dark skin and kind eyes. He drove Friedrich and 5 other prisoners to his farm in the back of a truck. The farm was 300 acres of flat land with a white house and a big red barn. Cows grazed in one field. Chickens walked around the yard. Everything looked clean and organized and prosperous. Mr. Johnson's son came out of the barn, carrying 2 buckets of water like they weighed nothing. The boy was maybe 14 years old. He stood 6 feet tall. His shoulders were wider than Friedrich's. His arms were thick with muscle that moved under his tan skin. He wore overalls and no shirt, and his chest was broad and strong. He set the buckets down and looked at the German prisoners with curious blue eyes. "This is my boy Tommy," Mr. Johnson said. "He'll show you what to do." Tommy worked alongside the prisoners all day. He picked cotton faster than any of them. He lifted bales that 2 German men had to carry together. He did not stop or slow down or complain. At lunch, his mother brought food to the field, and Tommy ate 4 sandwiches and drank a quart of milk, and then went back to work. Friedrich watched him and felt something die inside his chest. This boy had not been trained by the Hitler Youth. This boy had not been hardened by suffering. This boy had simply been fed his whole life, and now he was strong as an ox. Nature had made him what propaganda promised to make German boys, but never could. At the end of the day, Friedrich's back ached, and his hands bled from the cotton bowls. Tommy looked like he could work another 8 hours. He smiled at Friedrich and said, "You did good for your first day." His voice was deep and friendly. He sounded like a man even though he was just a child. Friedrich nodded and could not speak. A month passed. The prisoners fell into a routine. Work during the day. Food 3 times a day. More food than any of them had seen in years. Friedrich felt his body getting stronger. His ribs stopped showing. His face filled out. The prisoners joked that they would go home fatter than when they left. But the jokes had a bitter edge because they all knew what waited at home. They all had children who were hungry. They were eating like kings while their families starved. One Saturday night, the camp showed a movie. The guards set up a screen in the yard and ran a projector. Before the main movie, there was a newsreel about America. It showed factories making cars and planes. It showed harbors full of ships. It showed farms with machines harvesting wheat. Then it showed a high school football game somewhere in Texas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The players were boys aged 15 to 18. They wore helmets and pads and ran at each other with tremendous force. They collided like trains crashing. They picked each other up and slammed each other to the ground. Some of them were over 6 feet tall. Some weighed more than 200 pounds. They were not men. They were children. But they looked like warriors. Friedrich watched the screen and felt cold, despite the warm night. These were not soldiers. These were students. They went to school and played this brutal game for fun. They did this because they were young and strong and full of energy they needed to burn. In Germany, boys this age were being sent to fight with old men and broken rifles. They were dying by the thousands. These American boys were playing dot in November. A Red Cross truck arrived with packages for the prisoners. The packages came from American churches and schools. Each box had candy and cigarettes and writing paper and small gifts. The guard said most of the boxes were packed by children doing charity drives. Friedrich opened his box and found a bar of chocolate and a note written in crayon. It said, "I hope you like chocolate. I am praying for you." From Sally, age 9. Sally, age 9, had chocolate to give away. Sally, age 9, had enough that she could send some to enemy prisoners. Friedrich held the note and the chocolate and felt his throat close up. That night he wrote in his diary. He had been keeping a diary since France, but now he wrote things he knew the censors would not like. He wrote them anyway. He wrote in tiny letters in the margins where maybe no one would look. He wrote, "What we were told about America is lies. What we were told about Germany is lies. The truth is in the children. Their children are giants and ours are ghosts. How can we win? How could we ever have won?" Christmas came cold and gray to Mississippi. The prisoners had been in the camp for 5 months now. They looked different than when they arrived. Their faces were fuller. Their eyes were clearer. They had gained weight on American food. Some men said they felt guilty getting healthy while their families starved at home. Others said to enjoy it while it lasted, because soon they would go back to hunger. Friedrich said nothing, but he thought about it every day. The camp commander said there would be a Christmas celebration. Local churches had asked permission to visit and bring gifts. The prisoners cleaned the recreation hall and put up decorations made from paper and pine branches. It felt strange to celebrate Christmas in a prison camp in a foreign country while a war still raged. But the men were grateful for any break from the sameness of camp life. The day before Christmas, trucks arrived carrying American families. Mothers and fathers and children came through the gates with boxes of gifts and food. The guards watched carefully but did not seem worried. The Americans smiled and greeted the prisoners in English. Most of the Germans did not understand the words, but they understood the kindness. It confused them. They were the enemy. Why were these people being nice? The families set up tables with food. There were cookies and cakes and pies. There were candies wrapped in colored paper. There was hot cocoa and coffee. There was a whole roasted turkey that made the room smell like heaven. The children ran around excited and loud the way children everywhere do at Christmas. They were not afraid of the German prisoners. They looked at the men with curiosity and sometimes pity but never fear. Friedrich stood against the wall and watched. He did not feel like celebrating. He felt like an actor in a play he did not understand. A woman with gray hair came over and handed him a cup of cocoa. She said something in English and smiled. He nodded and said thank you in German. She patted his arm like he was her own son and walked away. Friedrich held the warm cup and felt. His eyes stinged. Then he saw the boy. The boy was standing near the Christmas tree talking to some other teenagers. He looked about 15 years old. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or a bit more. He had broad shoulders and long legs and stood with easy confidence. His hair was combed neat and he wore a clean button shirt and slacks. His face was open and friendly. He laughed at something another boy said and his teeth were white and perfect. When he moved, his body moved with smooth strength. Everything about him said health and vigor and youth and possibility. Friedrich could not look away. The boy looked exactly like the posters back home. The Hitler Youth posters showed tall blonde boys with strong jaws and bright eyes and powerful bodies. The posters said this was what German boys would become through discipline and sacrifice and the superiority of their race. The posters hung in every school and on every street corner. They promised parents that their thin, hungry children would grow into these gods, if they just believed hard enough. But they did not grow. They shrank. They weakened. They got sick. The posters were lies. The promises were lies. And here in front of Friedrich was the truth. This American boy had become what the posters promised without any of the ideology. He had become it simply by living in a country that had enough. Enough food. Enough milk. Enough peace. Enough of everything. The boy walked over to the food table and picked up a cookie. He ate it in 2 bites. He poured himself a cup of cocoa and drank it down. Then he got a piece of cake. He ate like someone who had never worried about his next meal, because he never had to worry. Friedrich watched him and felt everything he believed collapse like a building with its foundation blown away. That night Friedrich could not sleep. He lay in his bunk and stared at the dark ceiling. His mind would not stop. He kept seeing that boy. He kept comparing that boy to Hans. Hans who was small and weak. Hans who would never be tall or strong, no matter how much he believed or tried or sacrificed. Hans who had been betrayed by everything he was taught. Friedrich got up and found his diary. He sat under the single light bulb in the corner of the barracks. The other men were asleep. He opened the diary and began to write. He wrote faster than he ever had before. The words poured out like poison he needed to get out of his body. He wrote that everything they were told about Americans was backwards. Americans were not weak from having too much. They were strong because they had enough. German children were not being toughened by hunger. They were being destroyed by it. The master race was a lie. No race could be supreme when its children could not grow. The Americans had not defeated Germany with better weapons. They had defeated Germany long before the war started, in their kitchens and their farms and their schools. They had defeated Germany by feeding their children. He wrote that the Hitler Youth posters should have shown the truth. They should have shown thin boys with hollow eyes and crooked teeth, and bones that broke easily. They should have shown what sacrifice really looked like. But that would not inspire anyone. That would not make people believe. So they lied. They showed strong, beautiful boys that did not exist, and told parents their starving children were becoming Supermen. Friedrich wrote that he finally understood why Germany was losing. It was not because soldiers were cowards or generals made mistakes or enemies cheated. It was because you cannot fight the future with the past. You cannot send malnourished boys against healthy men and expect to win. You cannot build an empire when your foundation is crumbling. Children. He wrote about the 15-year-old American boy at the Christmas party. He wrote that this boy had never heard a speech about racial superiority. This boy had never been told that suffering made him special. This boy had just eaten breakfast every day of his life and grown tall. That was all it took. Food and peace and time. The simplest things. The things Germany could not give its children because it spent everything on war. Friedrich stopped writing. His hand hurt. His eyes burned. He read what he had written and knew it was dangerous. If the censors found this, they might punish him. But he did not care anymore. The truth was the truth. Hiding from it did not change it. He thought about going home. He thought about seeing Hans again. Hans would still be small. Nothing could fix that now. The damage was done. A whole generation was damaged. When the war ended, Germany would be a country of broken children trying to rebuild a broken nation. The Americans would go home to their tall, strong sons and daughters. They would go back to their abundant farms and busy factories. They would keep growing and building and moving forward while Germany dug itself out of ruins. Friedrich closed the diary and put it under his mattress. He lay back down but still could not sleep. He stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other German soldiers had realized the same thing he just realized. He wondered how many of them were lying awake tonight in camps across America, seeing the truth in the faces of American. children, and understanding that the war was already lost before it began. The war ended in May of 1945. Germany surrendered, and the camps in America began to empty. Some prisoners went home right away. Others waited months. Friedrich waited until February of 1946. He spent 20 months as a prisoner in Mississippi. 20 months of 3 meals a day. 20 months of safety and warmth. 20 months of growing stronger while his country grew weaker. When the orders finally came to ship out, Friedrich felt relief and dread mixed together in his stomach. The journey home took 3 weeks. First by train to New York, then by ship across the Atlantic. The ship was crowded with prisoners all going home. They stood at the rails and watched America disappear behind them. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They were going home, but home was not the place they left. They all knew it. They had seen the newsreels. They had heard the stories. Germany was rubble and ash. Germany was defeat and hunger. Germany was everything. America was not. Friedrich had packed his few belongings in a small bag. He had his uniform and some letters, and his diary hidden at the bottom wrapped in cloth. He also had a photograph. Mr. Johnson had given it to him on his last day at the farm. It showed Tommy standing next to a prize bull at the county fair. Tommy was 16 in the picture, 6 feet 2 inches tall, 200 pounds of farm-strong muscle. He was smiling his easy smile. On the back, Mr. Johnson had written, "So you remember your time here. God bless you and yours." Friedrich looked at that photograph every day on the ship. He studied Tommy's face and body. He memorized every detail. He needed to remember. He needed to carry proof of what he had seen, because he knew when he got home people would not believe him. They would think he was exaggerating or lying or broken by captivity. But the photograph was real. Tommy was real. The truth was real whether people believed it or not. The ship landed in Bremen in late February. The city was destroyed. Whole blocks were flattened. Buildings stood like broken teeth against the gray sky. Rubble filled the streets. People moved through the ruins like ghosts. They were thin and pale and dressed in rags. They did not look up or speak. They just kept moving, searching for food or fuel or some small thing to make life bearable for another day. Friedrich got off the ship and stood on the dock and felt like he had landed on a different planet. The air smelled of smoke and sewage and rot. Everything was broken. Everything was dirty. Everything was wrong. He had known it would be bad, but knowing and seeing were different things. This was not the Germany he left. This was Germany's corpse. He took a train to Stuttgart. The train moved slowly through the countryside. Everywhere Friedrich looked, he saw destruction. Bombed factories. Burned farms. Empty fields that should have been planted but sat barren. In America, the trains ran fast and smooth through green farmland full of fat cattle. Here the train limped along tracks that were barely repaired through a wasteland. Stuttgart was worse than Bremen. His neighborhood was mostly rubble. The building where his family lived still stood, but half of it was blown away. He climbed the stairs and his legs shook. He had not seen Anna and Hans in nearly 3 years. He did not know what he would find. He knocked on the door. After a long moment it opened. Anna looked old. She was only 34, but her hair was gray and her face was lined. She was thin as a stick. Her dress hung on her like a sheet on a skeleton. She stared at Friedrich like she was seeing a ghost. Then she made a sound and fell into his arms. She weighed nothing. He could feel every bone in her back. She sobbed against his chest, and he held her and looked over her shoulder into the apartment. Hans sat at the table. He was 13 years old now. He looked 9. He was maybe 5 feet tall and weighed perhaps 90 pounds. His clothes were too big. His face was hollow. His eyes were huge in his thin face. He stood up slowly, and Friedrich saw how his legs shook from just that small effort. Hans looked at his father and tried to smile, but his teeth were crooked, and some were missing. Malnutrition had destroyed them. Friedrich crossed the room and pulled his son into his arms. Hans felt like a bird, fragile, breakable. Friedrich thought of Tommy lifting hay bales and running across fields and eating 4 sandwiches for lunch. He thought of the American 15-year-old at the Christmas party. He held his son and felt rage and grief so strong he could not breathe. That first week Friedrich walked through Stuttgart and saw American occupation soldiers on every corner. They were healthy and clean and well-fed. They handed out chocolate bars and bread to German children. The children swarmed them like starving animals. They fought over the scraps. They cried with gratitude for 1 piece of candy. Friedrich watched a 7-year-old girl eat a chocolate bar so fast she made herself sick. She threw up and then tried to eat the chocolate again because it was too precious to waste. The Americans looked uncomfortable. They had not expected this. They had not expected children who looked like concentration camp victims. They had not expected a whole nation of Hanses. They gave out more food and more, but it was never enough. There were too many hungry children and not enough chocolate in the world. Friedrich started looking for work. He had been a teacher before the war. Now he went to the education office and asked if they needed teachers. The woman behind the desk was American. She spoke German with an accent. She looked at his papers and asked him questions. She hired him to help rebuild a school that had been bombed. Later he would teach there. The years passed. Germany slowly came back to life. The Americans poured money into the country through something called the Marshall Plan. They rebuilt factories and roads and bridges. They started school lunch programs. Everyday children got a hot meal at school. It was not much, but it was something. It was more than they had before. Friedrich became a school administrator. He worked with the Americans to set up nutrition programs. He fought for every pfennig to feed the children. Some people said he was obsessed. He did not care what they said. He had seen what well-fed children looked like. He had seen the future, and the future was tall and strong and only came from full bellies. He kept the photograph of Tommy on his desk. People asked about it. He told them it was from his time in America. He told them this was an American farm boy. They looked at the photograph and did not believe him. They said Americans could not all look like that. He said they did. He said American children were all like this. They said he was exaggerating. He stopped trying to convince them. The photograph sat on his desk, and that was enough. 10 years after the war ended, Friedrich stood in a school cafeteria and watched children eat lunch. They were still small compared to American children. They would always be smaller. The damage was done. You could not give back the years of hunger. You could not make bones grow that had stopped growing too soon. But these younger ones, the ones born after the war, they had a chance. They would eat every day. They would get milk and eggs and meat. They would grow as tall as their bodies allowed. Not as tall as Tommy, but taller than Hans. That was something. Friedrich went home that evening and wrote in his diary. He still kept the same one from the camp. He opened it to a blank page near the end and wrote his final entry. He wrote that in America he learned the master race was a lie. Not because all men were created equal in ability. That was not true. Some men were smarter or stronger or faster than others. But no race could claim to be supreme when its children were hungry. The Americans did not defeat Germany with better tanks or smarter generals. They defeated Germany decades earlier in their kitchens and dining rooms and dairy farms. He wrote that Germany had been fighting the future with an army from the past. They sent malnourished boys against healthy men and called it honor. They starved their children and called it strength. They believed propaganda instead of looking at what their own eyes showed them. The truth had always been there in the height charts at schools, in the ration cards, in the hollow cheeks of children. But no one wanted to see it. He wrote that the tallest Americans he ever met were not soldiers. They were children. And that told him everything about who had already won. A nation's strength was not measured in its weapons or armies or speeches. It was measured in the health of its children. Everything else was just noise. Friedrich closed the diary and put it on the shelf. He looked at the photograph of Tommy one more time. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. Tomorrow he will go back to work. Tomorrow he will feed more children. It was not glorious work. No one would write songs about it. But it was the most important work he would ever do. Because he had seen the alternative. He had seen what happened when you forgot that the future lived in the bodies of children. He would not let Germany forget again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.